Hey there, everyone. Wanted to put together a quick video regarding exercise selection and construction. So you have exercises that you currently like to use for specific conditions. Maybe you want to take and you want to start constructing some of your own exercises, and or maybe you just want to take and make sure that you are having a better understanding of what you currently use or don't use and what it gives you or doesn't give you. So that is the reason for this short video. So here's what the handout looks like. It is a thought process on paper. So it doesn't matter what your level of training is and or what type of training you had. You can put anything that you currently utilize into this paradigm, and you can add to it if there's additional things that you wanted to um, advance upon that are already here. So let's take a look at it first. Okay, so this was designed to be utilized as a template for putting together and constructing a rehabilitation exercise or a specific exercise for someone that you are looking at strengthening or getting ready for an activity or some type of competition, or maybe it's just doing stuff around the house. All of the above apply. You don't have to be a sports star to use this, and you don't have to be hurt. Okay, not all the sections in this template are going to necessarily apply to your specific situation. So keep that in mind. You can dive into these things as little as you want or as much as you want. I would suggest starting little. And then once you get the hang of something, let's add a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. Again, it's designed to help you expand upon your current thought process. So suggestions for use. You're going to see that for some of these sections, there are areas for progressions. We all know how to make something easier or harder. That's not tough, right? But understanding by taking and making something easier or harder, and your end goal, is that going to get you where you want? Are they ready for that change? Maybe you got to back off because you're noticing some measurable differences or changes that you're like, ugh, this isn't the direction we want to go. So maybe we gotta bring things down a couple notches. So what I would advise to you is to challenge yourself and utilize more progressions that you're not familiar with. And I'm going to attach an additional sheet to this that is just loaded with all kinds of different progressions. Some of them you may be familiar with, some of them you may not. Some of them lend themselves to more mobility work. Some of them lend themselves more to pain work. Some of them lend themselves more to motor control work. You can never have too many options, but you need to know what these options are going to do for you or not do for you if you apply them to a specific exercise that you're going to utilize. When you are finished with your exercise and they have performed it, okay, after the treatment, what I suggest you do, you're working off of a paradigm that's already in your brain. So why did you decide on the sets and ropes? Did you add a tempo in there? Is it a self-paced exercise? All these different ways that we set up our parameters to try to target what we're targeting. Maybe it's a specific plane of motion or a muscle contraction, or it's a arthrokinematic movement that we want to attempt to advocate and reproduce, right? Whatever the case may be, following when you get done, take some time and reflect and see if you can find the parameters that you used or you previously have learned and look them up, not in a textbook. Try to find some actual journal articles that will advocate and or utilize the parameters that you're using. And this can be tough in some cases because there are certain parameters that we just don't have locked down, and they vary so much. Motor control, for example, is different for everyone. It can be different between patients. It can be different between exercises on the same patient in between sets of a particular exercise in the same patient, it varies day to day and minute to minute sometimes. Okay. So you want to have strategies if something's not working, somebody's fatiguing out, pain is kicking back in. What are some other parameters that we can utilize to try to best justify and utilize what's there in the literature in order to combine with our expertise level and our patient values, all three stools or legs, not stools, all three legs of that EBP stool, right? In order to try to get the best outcome for those that we work with. Next point here, try to link all of your exercises back to a particular session goal. I have down 3 exercises here. Don't worry about that. Again, whether that is specific to what you want to do or not do. This can also not only just be exercise, it can be treatment driven as well too, for those of you that treat pain and those that have some movement dysfunction. Your treatment should be easy enough for the individual to incorporate and be able to replicate on their own. So if you're doing, let's say you're a clinician and you're doing joint mobilizations, are there a way that they can do those on their own at home? Is there some self-mobilization work that they can work on instead of just giving them exercises? So, and the answer to that is yes, depending on how you've been trained and how you understand the ability to see what should be taking place, measure what should be taking place, how much of it is needed, if there's too much of it, and then prescribe and construct the right things for them to do. And then lastly, if you are working with someone who is in pain or healing, make sure that what is constructed or selected is specific to their healing phase. If you're not working with someone who's in pain, then make sure it's specific to their training goals. Everything should be movement-based, not muscle-based, movement-based. Let's go down a little bit and take a look at this template. Feel free to change this up any way you want, but here is where this template is going to be the most useful for you. It's going to be in those body areas where you're like, ooh, there's a lot going on, and I'm not even sure where to begin. So if you don't have a mentor or somebody to take you through these things, what you need to do is break down this huge mountain that's in front of you into smaller steps. You're not going to climb the mountain in one day. So that being said, maybe you have someone who is experiencing some low back issues and you're trying to reduce pain, or maybe they're experiencing some issues where maybe they don't have enough mobility in their pelvis, right? So let's take a look at how this would work, because that's a big task. There's a lot of things that feed into that area, obviously, right? So you can fill in those upper boxes any way you want. Working on my morning coffee here. If you are working with someone who is in pain, okay, this is just to have you put a little check in there to remind you, you know, how long did these specific remodeling phases, and I don't want to just say remodeling, but these phases of healing take place per specific tissue. They are all different for any type of tissue. Ligaments different than bone, is different than tendon, is different than muscle. So you need to be aware of those things. Next, we have how long you're going to be working with the individual. Okay, then you have your specific session goals. We're going to use the SMART goal outline here. So when you're looking at the particular things that you have lined up to do with that individual that day, you got to ask yourself, is what I have set up for them, or if I have to modify some activity as we go along, which it's not uncommon, we have to do that, right? Is it specific to why the person came to see you to begin with? What is it addressing? Next, can you measure that you're making a change? And how can you measure that? Are you looking at total volume over a session? Are you looking at reduction of pain? Are you looking at greater range of motion? Are you looking at greater stabilization? You got to have a way to measure these things, and you can't only rely on the patient or client saying, hey, I feel better, I can move better. That's good. That's a big piece of the puzzle, and it's important, don't get me wrong. But what can we do to help the individual see that those gains are taking place and occurring? It provides them some more control. It gives them some buy-in. It can help make them more adherent to what you are providing them with. Next, is it attainable? Is this a goal that we can really get? Relevant? Is it relevant, again, to why that they are coming to see you in the first place? Or are you just taking a whole bunch of exercises from a textbook or whole bunch of exercises just to maybe produce a hypertrophic effect or endurance effect? What's it for? Even if it's for just straight up hypertrophy, well, okay, are they a bodybuilder? Okay, well, then they have to get into certain movements and use certain poses. Everything has a reason. If you can't come back and have a reason, maybe that reason is just vanity, right? And they want to look good with a tank top on, but they still want to be functional. Okay, how are we going to get there? What are we doing that is relevant to getting them there? And this is the conversation you want to have with that individual. How can we make this more relevant for you? And they'll love that, right? Because you're including them in the process. That's part of that patient values. They get to speak up and they get to have some input and some stock into what's going on, as opposed to, all right, you come to me and I'll just tell you what to do. And then lastly, time-based. What time frame are we looking at here? Is it maybe a week at a time, and you want to recheck things after 1 week because you're dealing with a dysfunction or a pain or something to that effect? Okay, so these are some things to think about. And realistically, you should be able to bring every exercise or treatment or component of what you're doing with a patient back to these 5 things. Even if it is some psychological strategies as they're working out, some motivational strategies, right? These just aren't physical exercise and that's it. Okay, then we can have some short-term, long-term goals. This is great when you're meeting with a patient, this first page, for like a first session. So you have these things in front of you and you have them mapped out and you're going through them together. And then from there, as you progress on and maybe you see the client or patient a couple times, you say, hey, here's where you're currently at right now. Remember, this is why you came in. Here's what we talked about. Here's what we agreed on. Do you still feel that we're moving in the right direction? What's your thought on all this at this point? Nate, I can't tell you how far that goes. It goes quite a ways. Okay, so selecting your treatment or a specific exercise category. So to get you to think about things, for those of us that treat pain, okay, what are you going to use for your pain treatment? Is it a bag of ice? Is it NSAIDs? Are they on painkillers, muscle relaxants? Are you going to use the exercise itself to control the pain? What is it that you're going to do? So let's take something easy that we've all been told, okay, whether you agree with it or not. Let's say that we want to give somebody some ice. So we give them a bag of ice. All right, how long should it be on there for? This is body area dependent. How long do you have to have a bag of ice on someone before it reaches a particular tissue depth and it can actually do anything? And then ask yourself, what's the physiological justification? Now, don't go back to what you learned in school. Okay, you already know that. If you've already used a specific mindset, now when you're done with this treatment, you're going to go back and you're going to look up how much is there in peer-reviewed research to actually back up what I did. And you're going to find that some things have a lot of research and some have zero. Okay. And then obviously we need a way to measure that actually did something. So if you're looking for a pain relieving effect, how are you going to measure that? You're going to use a pain rating scale. If you're going to do that, then what scale are you going to use? There's tons of them out there. Which one's the most accurate for ice? How big of a change on that scale do you need to have for it to be considered clinically appropriate? And there's going to be what's clinically appropriate for the individual you're working with, as well as what's in the literature as far as clinical appropriateness. So there's some variation there, and ultimately, your patient has to have some buy-in and want to do it and feel like it's helping them. Otherwise, you should be utilizing something else in that time frame. All right, if we're going to do some mobility work, it's the same thing. You're going to do some foam rolling. You're going to do some self-mobilization. Are you going to do the vibration and percussion guns are huge these days. Okay, so what is your physiological justification here? Why are you doing it? Okay, and then how are you going to measure that? That's an easy one, right? You could do that if you're in a clinical setting, then you could do that with an inclinometer, a goniometer. There's so many apps that can do these things now. Next, we got motor control and movement retraining. This is where you're going to have a tough time finding some things. And what you end up having to look for here are strategies. When it comes to motor control, I'm going to tell you right now, there's no magic sets and reps on this. And there's so much that we are still learning. So maybe your motor control strategy that you're going to use is to utilize a specific tempo at which the person performs an exercise at, and you're going to use a metronome so they can hear the clicks, 1 click per second. Okay, and maybe they're doing a 4-2-2 on an exercise, 4 seconds. Let's say it's a squat, 4 seconds down, eccentric, a 2-second isometric hold, and 2 seconds up. Okay, so what in the literature would say we need more eccentric time. Why do that? Okay, and there's a couple of good things that you could use there. So we know that from a standpoint in terms of having something to focus on attention wise, and that would be the sound of that metronome. Increase focus, increases the ability to learn something, and it increases the motor output coming from the brain and central nervous system. Okay, and then we also know that of the 3 types of exercise, that eccentric exercise produces the most motor output as well, right? So can the patient do an eccentric exercise and listen and focus at the same time? And now we're playing around with a couple strategies, and that's how you have to look at motor control. You can try to look up sets and reps. You're not going to find anything. There's just a lot of different variables here, and it's all based off of what the patient needs. Okay. And then obviously, what is your measure to see if they improved the actual movement? Okay. And that measure may have to be between sessions. So maybe they banged out 3 reps in a perfect form on a Monday, and then they come in on a Wednesday and they can only do 4 reps. Okay. All right. Did they keep it? Did they not keep it? Did they get more? Did they get less? Okay. So what we're looking for with motor control is the ability to get better and better at learning and performing something over time. Over time is imperative when it comes to learning, whether that is something strictly psychological or it has to do with motor movement. Okay. Now, when we go to strength, endurance, cardio, and power, these are the NSCA position statements really lock these in for us. I want to take a quick minute here and just make sure that we're not interchanging the terminology of motor control and strength training. Okay. Strength training is a very general term that is swapped out with motor control quite a bit. Okay, and when you look at motor control and stabilization, you will find articles that will say, well, if you have a bigger cross-sectional area of a muscle, that can increase stabilization. It can, that's true, but remember, it's the brain that ultimately controls the amount or power of that neuromuscular efficiency that's taking place during stabilization. So if you want the power switch flipped on to the stabilization, having the foundation there with the hypertrophy is good, but ultimately you need the power source turning it on. So we need to be able to access that. Okay, so think of motor control / stabilization as the ability to perform a movement correctly. Okay, and then once you have that movement pattern down, form is good, it's controlled, it's gone from static to dynamic, and you can move in and out of a position. Then we're starting to look at strength. So now we got a good patterning going on. Now let's strengthen it up and add weight to it, resistance to it, ground reaction force, gravity, all that stuff that we need and our body has to handle when we partake in activity, right? Even if this is just walking around all the way up to running and jumping, you're going to have various demands of body weight going through the system. Just actually got done reading a good article on core stabilization and athletics, stating that when you're looking at anything from walking all the way up to some of these sports, that the body weight that you have to control through the entire system can be anywhere between 6 and 17 times your body weight. That's a lot. And you're not going to get that in a clinic strictly with just motor control exercises. You'll get the patterning, but then what we got to do is take that next step and we got to strengthen that pattern. And we have to do it in functional specific ways. Okay. And that's where we can look up our NSCA guidelines for sets, reps, tempo, percentage of a 1 rep max, all of that. That information can easily be obtained through NSCA position statements on what exercise should look like. In terms of strength, another good cheat on that is blood flow restriction training. For those of you not familiar with that, I'll let you look that up. Others of you that use it, it's a great way clinically to actually build the strength while you in hypertrophy, while you are reestablishing that motor control. It's a huge cheat for the body. Okay, so that goes the same for endurance, cardiovascular, and power as well too. Make sure that you have a reference and you understand what you're tracking. Here's usually the go-to, and it's a good start, but it's very, very limited in its scope and what it can do for a person. People will say, well, strength is 8 to 10, endurance is 12 and up in terms of reps, and power, you're looking at 6 to 8. Yeah, that's great for reps. Okay, so now you got to look at how many sets are we doing? How much rest time do we need? How well is the person recovering? What type of activity are they partaking in? So we get the correct functional strength, endurance, and power for that specific activity. And at the end of the day, what is it you're looking at having them do? Do they have to get through a 14-week season, 16-week season, and gradually work their way up in order not to break down and reach a peak at a particular time? What's the goal here? So it's not enough to just say, here's the sets, here's the reps, and just do this and partition it off. There is, for those of you that are strength and conditioning specialists or personal trainers, you know there's much more that goes into this. So now you're looking at focusing and planning for the long term in order to be able to reach a specific goal that the individual is coming to you for at the end of the day. Okay, now, when you have an area where there's a lot going on, we're looking at you got to ask yourself, what is it we are trying to restore or complement or improve, right? So this, look at this as a basic way of saying, oh my God, it's the low back. There's so many things here. I don't know where to start. Let's take one little piece of the low back that maybe you need practice working with, and let's get used to understanding that area. And then once we've done things 3, 4, 5 times, then we can add on to it. And it's not so daunting anymore. Now you're good at that. And we're going to add a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And then it all becomes second nature, right? So this is a nice way to quote unquote dumb things down, but still give you a thought process and a way to kind of focus on things. So here's what we're looking at. First of all, take and either record the movement that you want the individual to be able to do, or they want to be able to do, and then or whatever it is that you are looking at restoring. Okay, so we would put that in the first box here. Maybe the restoration, the movement that we want to do is, let's take something easy. And let's say it is squatting without pain. Okay, so we want to be able to get into a good, solid back squat position. What is the selected activity pattern that we want to link this to? Let's say that squat is going to be linked to picking things up off the ground. Let's say you're an industrial worker and you have to bend down and pick up boxes and put them up on a shelf. You work at Amazon 8 hours a day. So what we're trying to do is understand what takes place at a particular joint when you do that particular style of movement. And we're looking at, maybe the goal is to bulletproof this individual as best as we can and figure out how can we prevent these things? How can we train these things so that they don't break down as fast and we can maintain, you know, being into something for the long haul, right? So when we're looking at this, is there a particular phase of this exercise or movement pattern or movement capacity that you want to restore? And in this case, let's say that when the person goes down into the squat, they really tuck under pretty quick and they go into lumbar flexion immediately. And we want to have a better squatting form for them so that they're not getting that excessive lumbar flexion and stress in the low back. Okay, so we would say the descent of the squat. Okay, what is the targeted physiological movement for this particular exercise? So now what we got to do is we have to look at what specific area do we want to apply this to, right? So let's say that we're looking at applying this to the, let's say the SI joints, right? So you know that when we move the SI joints are composed of the pelvic innominate, and then we have the sacrum in the middle. So there's got to be some tilting there relative of one to the other. Okay, so maybe the targeted physiological movement is with this individual, since they're tucking under so quick, maybe we want to keep the lower back in more of a neutral position as they're coming down to pick up that box. So we want to keep them in more of a lumbar lordotic position. Okay, I don't want to say too much lordosis, but just enough to be able to not go into too much excessive flexion as they're going down. So in order to do that, we got to make sure that we have the right amount of movement between the pelvic innominate bones tilting forward, and the sacrum is going to be, we'd say, counter-nutating relative to those bones and being moved back a little bit, right? And that's only a few degrees. It's debatable how much that is, but there is relative movement there. They do move a little bit independently from one another. So we're going to say maintaining a anterior pelvic tilt in order to remain in more of a neutral lumbar lordosis. So that's our targeted physiological movement there. So then we want to know next, does that patient have full active range of motion and passive range of motion in a fully unloaded, relaxed position prior to even training them? So let's say the person's not in pain, because pain's a whole different ballgame. We want to know, does that person have enough lordosis in the lower spine, or do they have a straighter lower spine? Okay, so what position are they in? Can they actually have some space there when they're laying down supine? Is there some space, or are they completely flat? And I'm talking underneath the low back. Can you slide your hand underneath there a little bit or not? Okay, so do they like to live while they're relaxed in more of a lumbar flex position, which would mean that their back's a little flatter, or are they more in a lumbar lordosis position in which their lower back is a little higher off the table, right? So you try to get them as relaxed as possible. Sometimes, now if you're doing this with somebody in pain, that's not the easiest thing to do. And sometimes even when you relax them as much as possible, you are not going to be able to get them completely unloaded, laying down on their back, on their stomach, on their side. Sometimes you just cannot find a position in which you can shut the pain off and the person can just relax for a variety of reasons, right? But for this case, let's not talk about pain. So let's assume that this individual, we could stick a couple pillows underneath their low back while they're laying on their back, and we can see that they have a nice forward curve. And if we flip them over on their stomach and we prop a couple pillows underneath there, we could see that their lower back can get into a nice straight line when they're on their stomach, and that would tell us that we're in more of a flex position. So we know that when they're relaxed, they have the ability to be in a anterior and posterior tilted position, right? Because when we're anteriorly tilted, we have more lumbar lordosis. And then when we're posteriorly tilted, we know that we have more of a lumbar flexion type posture, okay? So that lets us know that, hey, we have the mobility to get in and out of that position. Now, if they can't do those things, then we're looking at, maybe our exercise construction or our treatment construction needs to involve some mobility work here. And again, be careful with pain, because pain is a whole different beast. If you're in pain, you're going to have hypertonicity regardless of what position you get them in. It can just be very difficult to shut that off, okay? And you may not be able to. So then in that case, that line is kind of null and void, and you have to take what you can get in terms of, what's the best position for this person and have some understanding as to why. When we're moving to corresponding accessory movements, now what we want to look at here is we want to say to ourselves, all right, what's the accessory movement? What is our roll, spin, glide, compression, distraction? What are we looking at? And this is where you need some advanced training. And what I would suggest you do here, we're looking at the low back, and oh my gosh, when it comes to the SI joints and we're on our feet, we can get pain in that area pretty much as a result of any other area in the body being dysfunctional. It can be in the upper extremities, because we know that our arms have direct connection into the spine, and that connection can travel down into the ground, into the earth through our feet. So we got 2 arms and legs and a head that all feeds into the spine. That goes down into the sacrum, which then splits off and goes down into each leg, and each leg does what it needs to do to handle, absorb, redistribute, and transfer that force. And then it works the other way up too, right? So you have 2 feet in which now you got to deal with what's taking place with the ground, and that is traveling up the legs into the SIJs on each side, and then up the spine. And now you're using that in your spine and your head and your arms. So the highway goes in both directions. So if you look at the SI joints, right, you have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head that travel and can use that highway going through that particular area. So to say the problem is just at the sacroiliac joints, we can't just pinpoint that. And that's what makes low back pain so tricky, is that we're taught to, and that when we look at textbooks, things are simplified in order to, well, just look at this area or that area of the spine, and here's what should be happening at the sacroiliac joint, and just make sure that this is happening. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. And for any of you that have treated a low back or wanted to make a low back more mobile or stable, it's pretty tricky if you're not sure how the rest of the body feeds into these areas. So this is where you can begin to try to weigh through these things. So maybe you want to start at the feet, maybe a particular joint at the feet. Maybe you want to take the hind foot. Okay, and the person says that when I pick that box up off the ground, my right foot is going to be in front of my left foot. It's like doing a modified lunge, basically. And I'm going to reach down and grab that box. Well, then you'd say, okay, at the hind foot, what's taking place here? What kind of compression, distraction, gliding, rolling, spinning? What do we have taking place at that particular joint, right? And at the hind foot, you could write in here subtalar joint. Okay, so this is where you need to understand what takes place at the subtalar joint and how that joint moves and what it does to the joint above it and the joint above that and the joint above that. Because once we understand how that feeds into the SI joint, as you are standing with your right foot forward and your left foot back, then we can start playing around with our exercise options and try to find ways of challenging that joint to get it to be more stable if you want to try to bulletproof something, right? Or if you are working on decreasing pain and trying to get the ankle to talk more to the lower leg, to the knee, to the hip, all the way up to the SI joint in a standing position, then what can that hind foot, that subtalar joint, do for us to help support the SI joint? Okay, and it's the same thing for the knee. It's the same thing for the hip. It's the same thing for the pelvis. And then your arms. And so now you're looking at, holy cow, wow, this is where this is really, really complicated, right? And it is, but you got to start somewhere. Instead of just saying, well, here's an exercise, I'm going to have you brace your core, and then I'm going to have you get on a TRX and squat up and down. How does that necessarily recreate what should be taking place with the pattern that we want to restore and the activity we want to link it to, the phase of that activity that we want to bulletproof or improve, the movements that are taking place, as well as the actual joint arthrokinematics. They all go together. So this is where you can start creating exercise, and or you can start taking the exercises that are in your library and reverse engineering them. Instead of saying, well, I'm going to use this exercise to improve this, now you can take that exercise and you can plug it into this and say, at that particular joint, what is it giving me? What is it not giving me? And then you can tweak it in a variety of ways. The reverse engineering is so powerful because now everyone has 1,000,001 exercises in their toolbox. And it's not about a best set of exercises for an injury or bulletproofing something. Everyone is so individualized. What it comes down to is having a way to evaluate these things and understanding what should take place in order to create that ultimate bulletproofing for that individual. Okay, randomized control trials, and these are the best exercises. That's great for generalizability when you don't have time and you don't have know-how to do something like this, but there's going to be a lot of people that things don't work for, and low back pain is a perfect example. There are no best exercises for low back pain because there are a variety of ways that low back pain can be made worse or better on any particular given day for any individual going through any set of circumstances. There are way too many subset variables that we have to address. So let's just start with the basic ones. And why don't we get a better understanding of the exercises that we're currently using and deconstructing them so that we can make them better for what that person needs based off of our SMART goals that we talked about upstairs a couple pages, right? Okay, next we have, okay, so we've identified what should be taking place from an osteokinematic or your basic physiological movements, which is what we learned in A&P, right? Flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. We're all familiar with those terms. Now we need to know the rolling, spinning, gliding that needs to take place along with those movements. So we're breaking it down smaller. Now let's take a look at how, let's bring them back together now that we've deconstructed those things. And let's look at muscle groups and or fascial lines. I am not a big fan of muscle groups alone, and muscle groups are a part of fascial lines. Okay, we've identified that these things are in place, and think of your fascial lines as highways that force travels. It gets absorbed, it gets redistributed. Okay, it's all about understanding what holds us together, and fascia does that. Think of like a grapefruit. I'm going to steal this from a good colleague of mine, Dr. Pat St. Louis down at Texas A&M. When he talks about fascial lines, he shows a picture of a cut grapefruit. And when you're done eating a red grapefruit, you've dug out all the grapefruit, but then you still have the peel on the outside. And then you still have the guts of the inside that's tough and provides form to that grapefruit. Okay, think of the muscles as what you took out of the grapefruit. And now what are you left with? You're left with all these other structures. You're left with ligaments, you're left with fascia, you're left with bones. So this is, you know, your form closure that we have. We have force closure, which is the dynamic force that we get from actual contraction and tension of a dynamic activity. And then we have form closure, which is the structure itself. How sound is that structure? Is it really sound like an SI joint where the joints themselves are almost like interlocking puzzle pieces? Or are we relying more on dynamic force closure, which would be more like a glenohumeral joint of the shoulder, in which the socket is very shallow, it's very small, and then you have this huge head that sits on top of it. It's like a golf ball sitting on a golf tee, and we rely a lot more on fascial and muscular dynamic force to keep things where it needs to be as we move, right? So that's where this comes into play. So I would advise you to take a look at, okay, if I'm performing a movement in a squat, what fascial lines are going to help me stabilize? And what do we want to target? Is it going to be more of if we're looking strictly at tilt of the pelvis, going back to the SI and being able to control that, what type of stability do we have through our posterior fascial line, in our anterior fascial line, in our spiral lines? We have so much there. So you'd have to look at, if I take a picture of all my fascial lines, then which ones cross the SI joint? That's a great place to start right there, okay? And then how does the rest of the anatomy play into those things? Because again, think of it as like a highway system. This is one of the paths that force can travel or divert through, right? Okay. And then what type of movement is taking place across the area that you're looking at? Is it concentric? Do we have shortening? Is it eccentric? Are you asking somebody to do something isometrically? Okay, so it's very, very important to understand that concentric, eccentric, and isometric don't have to be specific to muscle contraction. They can be specific to movement patterning, right? Very, very important. That's the nervous system takes and provides us options that are specific to movement synergies as opposed to individual contractions. Okay, then from there, we're looking at progressions that we want to do. So once a person's got a movement or a pattern, how are we going to make it harder? And when I say harder, we are just not looking at making things, adding weight, adding sets, adding reps, adding volumes. That's the traditional resistance training parameters that we're looking at. Okay, there are a lot of other options that you have. And again, look at the attachment that I have along with this brief lecture. And there's all kinds of options on there. And a lot of them can be used for neuroplasticity, neuroplastic retraining. Maybe I use the example above of attentional focus, right? If I give you let's say that you are really, really good at a single leg balance, and you wanna take that single leg balance now and you wanna increase the difficulty, because with the individual's task, they have to be able to be on a single limb stance and be able to be thinking of multiple things at once. So let's just say 2 things at once. So now we're looking at dual task training, right? Can they perform counting or reciting something or identifying and looking at something as they are doing that single balance task that you asked them to do, right? So now we're strengthening the neurological connection in order to be able to do that task, because the last one is just plain easy and we want to make it more sport specific. I want that to eventually at some point transfer into running on a field and thinking about, all right, here I am in relation to this individual on the field. They're going to pass me the ball, or I have to run a route, or whatever the case may be, right? What's your justification for that? Find some peer-reviewed research that looks at increasing attentional focus demand. What do we need to do? What's there? What do we know? What do we not know? And the cool thing about thinking this way is you're going to find that there's probably a lot of defaults that you go to, and then when you go to look them up, you're like, there's nothing there. So then where do you go from that? Again, this is where it comes back to being able to, I'm going to scroll back up here, right? When we're looking at, maybe you want to do dual task training, right? But how are you going to measure if they're improving? So they've done well with their single leg stance while they're concentrating. Okay, how did you measure that? And how did you determine that they got better in order to move on to something else? And now you can do that same thing with dual task training, right? You can put that right in there. You got to have a way of measuring things. And then you can see, all right, I'm doing too much. We've done not enough. I can boost this up. Maybe it's time on task. Maybe I can balance longer after 2 sessions of kind of here. I could do 15 seconds and I needed a break, and I could do that for 5 or 6 sets. And the next time they come in, they're like, hey, you know, I can do 20 seconds. All right, well, we just made an improvement there in terms of what you could do. And how are we going to measure that? Well, maybe we measure that using the Sway app, right? A lot of people use Sway. That's a great clinical tool for balance. And all they got to do is hold their cell phone right here, and you can do a pre and you can do a post. Or maybe you want to use that as you're going along while you're training to see what is the level. Maybe if after I get to about 12, 15 minutes, I'm done. I can't hold form anymore. And I'm starting to go from that 20 seconds down to 15 seconds, down to 10 seconds. All right, so where's this going? I could use the physical numbers themselves of the time on task. That would be another way of doing it if you don't have a Sway app. Okay, so we have to have a way to measure these things in order to further the individual along. Otherwise, we're really guessing here, just because the way a patient feels is only part of that puzzle. Okay, and then the same thing goes for decreasing difficulty. right? So what can we do? A common go-to that I like to use is a person can't, they can't balance, let's go back to the single leg stance. They can't balance as well as we'd like them to. Why don't we put them in more of a stabilized position? Let's add some stability in there. So instead of having them free floating in space, maybe we allow them to put two fingers on a wall. Maybe we allow them to do a toe touch. Okay. Maybe we give them something to focus on, because we know if they focus on a particular, maybe they have to focus on a particular area, they're looking at themselves in a mirror so they can see their form, right? That feedback can help decrease the difficulty. Again, all kinds of options here. Check that sheet out. Okay. So when we look at that, now we have a nice blueprint here on some basics of one small area that we want to assess or restore. Now, what do? We take an exercise and we either create it or we go into our toolbox with one that we already know. This doesn't look any different. This is the same exact template that we just saw. So what we're trying to do is look at, here's the exercise. If we go all the way back up to the top, what's our goal? Will that exercise get us the goal? And in order to determine if it's going to get us the goal, we need to know the individual parts of the exercise, which is what we just completed partially here in section 3. We took one small component of it and we broke it down further. Okay, so now you put your single leg balance on here while performing, maybe you're going to do some ocular training, some gaze stabilization training to work on, getting full eye range of motion and being able to make sure that they can have their vestibular ocular response working as they are standing on a single foot. So maybe you're having them stare straight ahead and doing some no and yes exercises, right? To make sure that they have the proper motion. Now we can take that exercise, put it in here and determine how is that going to help our hind foot? How is that going to help our, how is that going to help our SI joints? Okay, then from there, we look at and we just plug things in. Okay, so we're going to have that person do that exercise while they're holding an isometric squat, someplace in the range of motion, okay, that you see as being beneficial for them. Okay, what is that going to do for the physiological movement that you're trying to restore in the hind foot, in the eyes, in the SI joint? Okay, are we giving them what they need right here by having them pre-position their body in a specific type of stance while they're doing that squat? Do we want, I use the example of right foot ahead of left, do we want to put that right foot ahead of the left one a little bit to mimic what they're going to be partaking in, to kind of bulletproof or make the activity more functional if they're not having pain? And you're looking at building that up. Okay, and then again, what fascial lines are we targeting? How do we make it harder? How do we make it easier? Okay, from there, home exercise programming. I am a big advocate on whatever you give them clinically, you try to have some form of it that they can take home. And I like the KISS principle, 2 to 3 exercises. Keep it simple, keep it direct. Don't give them 1,000,001 cues. Give them just a couple things to focus on that they need to target. And then I usually ask the individual, can I see your phone? We record it on their phone. You give them specific parameters and instructions of them recording you doing it so they can see what a good model of it looks like and they can refer back to it. And there you go. You have it right there. And that doesn't have to take extra time. When you go to initially teach the person how to do it, you have them record it right there on the spot. They see it, they listen to the explanation, and then they try it themselves. So you're not taking time out of your session if you only have 30 minutes with an individual. So from there, throw in your references if you've looked stuff up, and or you can use this section. I put some question marks there. What is my reasoning for doing a 4-2-2 tempo? Can I actually find this? Does it actually work? You know, I know they told me in my NASM protocols that I should be using this. So let's go find some information on it. So you can use that as a reminder. Hey, I'm done with the session. Let's go look this up. What can I find? And then once you have found, some solid things to back you up, now you're starting to build a library. And you can kind of, I like to make folders on my computer in my training sessions to say, hey, just so you know, if you're wondering why we're doing this, I got all kinds of articles here that can back this up. And now you're creating, you're building. At first, it takes a little bit of time to do this, but man, what a resource you have there. Your clients and your patients understand that what you're doing is evidence-based in terms of the literature point of that three-legged stool. And then, you also have some quantitative measures as well as their qualitative measures, how they're feeling about things. And you are using awesome EBP approach while you're working with people. It's just not about the literature itself and research itself. It's really about this entire process, which is why I put this whole thing together. So I hope you got something out of this. I would highly encourage you to try using it piece by piece by piece, especially with those areas that you're like, this is just too much. It doesn't have to be. So scale it down, start with little chunks and move from there. Okay, that's my best advice. Don't overload yourself. Otherwise, you're not going to want to do it. You won't be as efficient. It's going to take time out of your sessions. And, go with what you already know at this point and make yourself better while you're making your patients and your clients better. Pass that information along, pay it forward. So until next time, take care. And the sheet that I was referring to with all the progressions on it, I will link to in the description below. Have a good one. Hit me up if you have any questions or comments.